I'm Paul Devontier, Executive Director of Communications for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The year was 1950, and I was standing very close to this spot as a 4-year-old boy. I lived a long way from here at the time, but I had come to St. Louis with my parents and my Aunt Annie to see radio station KFUO on the campus of Concordia Seminary. Some 20 years later, I would return to that campus as a student and would become a part-time employee of KFUO. Later, from 1974 to 1982, I would become general manager. From its infancy in 1924 to today, KFUO has been committed to sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ not only with the St. Louis community, but with the world. This is KFUO's story. It's a story of America's oldest religious radio station and its struggle to continue to be free to voice the gospel. At the time I visited in 1950, KFUO had already celebrated its 25th anniversary. Owned and operated by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the small radio operation had become an operation with worldwide dimensions.
You can understand that we need a revival of true Christian faith.
The Lutheran Hour, an idea that was born at KFUO and a program that originated there for many years under the sponsorship of the Lutheran Laymen's League, had achieved enormous success. Dr. Walter A. Meyer, the nationally known voice of the Lutheran Hour and one of the founders of the station, had become one of the greatest radio speakers of his generation. In 1948, KFUO became a pioneer in FM broadcasting. KFUO-FM was the first FM station in St. Louis and one of the first FMs in the country. The value of radio was unquestioned.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Through the Depression years and through the years of World War II, radio had become a valuable source of information and entertainment. It was a treasured companion for most Americans, and for many, an important source of spiritual strength and inspiration, too. In fact, by 1950, an association of religious broadcasters was already quite active.
It was in 1944 that there was a major problem facing religious broadcasting. And that was programs like the Lutheran Hour, the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour, and numbers of others which were national interest, were losing out in the use of network time as well as large broadcast stations around the country. And there was pressure being put on the stations and the networks not to sell any religious time to those kinds of ministries. NRB was formed to combat that problem and to make way for the gospel to have access freely over the stations and the networks of the nation.
As television began to emerge from its infancy, many thought radio would die. But radio not only survived, it flourished. A radio extension service was begun in the 1950s to provide pre-recorded programs to radio stations all over the United States. During the 60s, KFUO was providing programming to literally hundreds of radio stations from coast to coast, and even provided materials for use in foreign countries. During the 1970s, the FM station, that would become known as Classic 99, was upgraded to a 100,000-watt facility. New resources and programs were being offered to other radio stations. The gospel voice of KFUO and KFUO-FM remained strong, and its outreach continued. During the 1980s, KFUO-FM, known for its classical and sacred classical music and for its religious features, became one of the top classical music stations in the country. Along with the FM station, KFUO-AM maintained its reputation for quality religious programming that was used and appreciated by listeners nationwide. The stations even helped a group acquire a station and begin KNGN, a Christian broadcast operation in southwest Nebraska. a daughter station of KFUO. From the very beginning through the late 1980s, KFUO and KFUO-FM had unblemished records with the Federal Communications Commission. But as the decade of the 90s began, KFUO faced a challenge that would prove to jeopardize everything for which it had worked, as well as the religious freedoms it had taken for granted for more than 65 years. In January 1990, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People filed a petition with the FCC to deny a number of broadcast licenses in the state of Missouri. KFUO's licenses were included. What followed was a very lengthy and costly litigation that is yet unresolved more than 6 years later.
What we have been through over the last few years, we don't question the divine reason. It has been a supreme test.
It was alleged that KFUO was a discriminator and a liar, that it did not have a meaningful affirmative action program. In the course of the ensuing FCC litigation, it was alleged that the hiring of seminary students for part-time positions violated FCC rules. It was alleged that recruiting employees from within the church body and from the Christian community was not appropriate or sufficient and was inherently discriminatory. The government's assumption in the 4.5 years leading up to the formal hearing was that KFUO was guilty and that the burden was on it to prove its innocence.
The most frustrating thing was that we had to prove our innocence. We had to fight through negative charges that were just thrown out, and we were forced to deny those charges and then produce paperwork to back up that. Being assumed guilty until proven innocent is a difficult position to be in.